Today we're going to talk about the Baroque Age. When we use the word Baroque, in reality it refers to the art that is started to be done in Europe and also later in the Americas from the 17th century, and it continued in part of the 18th century. But we are using this word now referring also to the society and politics of this period. So firstly, we can see this image of Louis XIV, painted by probably one of the most famous painters of this period, of the 17th century, and the portrait of the Sun King. That is how Louis XIV of France was called, because of his huge power as an absolute monarch. Because the Baroque period is going to be a period of contrasts. Most of the European nations were going to be ruled under absolute monarchies, and then we're going to have some exceptions in a couple of countries that started to develop another type of political system that we can say that it will be the precedent of nowadays democracy. So first, in this first video, we are going to talk about the society. So although there were some differences on society, in contrast with the Middle Ages and the early modern era, we still see a huge difference between the privileged and the non-privileged groups. So we still have privileged groups with laws that applied especially to them, and that, like the fact that they didn't pay taxes, and they held most of the wealth. So we can see a difference between the clergy that still remain having predominant position in European and also in the colonial societies, also in the American continent, because they reproduce the same model as the European society. So the clergy, both in Catholic and Protestant countries, remain having importance, although obviously in the Catholic countries had a biggest importance and more privileges. And then we still have a nobility that, although is diminishing its economic and political power, still is privileged because they didn't have to pay taxes, and in many cases they own most of the land and they didn't have to work. And then we have a majority of the population that were non-privileged, that had to pay taxes, that had to work very hard, and that in reality were the motor of this society. We still have a majority of peasants. In the 17th century, more than 90% of the European population, and something similar or even more in the Americas, were peasants and work in agriculture and livestock farming. And then we have a growing minority of artisans and a bourgeoisie in the cities that were going to grow throughout all this period. So although there was still a minority of the population, artisans and the bourgeoisie started to be more important. So we are going to see some changes, and in the more advanced and prosperous countries, namely in Northern Europe, we are going to see how this bourgeoisie is going to acquire a more important role in politics, and in many cases are going to acquire nobility titles as a way just to confirm their importance. Whereas the majority of the population as peasants were going to still having very hard lives, having to pay increasing taxes and suffering the problems of bad harvests, which in the 17th century are going to be common because there was a pretty cold and humid period of time.